A woman, devalued by her family, arrives for Christmas and is faced with cold and alienation. Instead of pain, she chooses the path of self-discovery. Gradually finds herself. Returns stronger and freer. Last year, at Christmas, everything seemed familiar until the moment he arrived. Opening the door, he could barely hold back his laughter, as if hiding some secret. The air in the room was instantly filled with tension mixed with an unknown foreboding. His words, although spoken without much emotion, sounded like a challenge, this year only for the family. His wife, obviously not hiding her surprise and even slight displeasure, reacted so sharply that it forced everyone present to be silent for a moment and reconsider their expectations. I smiled, not giving way to doubts, and entered the house, as if not noticing the internal tension. The feeling of the holiday suddenly filled the space, and I felt that this Christmas would be different. Without unnecessary words, without unnecessary explanations, just us, the family, together. The first hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of cooking, which spread throughout the house, like music filling the space with warmth and comfort. It seemed that every movement, every gesture had meaning, and each of us was looking for our own way to cope with the invisible tension that prevailed. Christmas is a time when everyone expects a miracle, but on this night the miracle awaited us in a different form. We did not know that this evening would question everything we considered familiar and unchanging. And it was not only about the relationship between a brother and his wife, it was something bigger, deeper, more personal. Past images, unspoken words, unresolved questions began to gradually reveal themselves, like shadows that had long been hidden in the corners of the soul. Even simple things took on new meaning, looks, gestures, unexpected smiles, or anxious silences. All this created a complex, multi-layered puzzle that had to be put together to understand the true essence of what was happening. The feeling of wonder that usually filled this holiday was transformed here into something more personal, into discovery and acceptance, into a clash of reality with hopes. That night was the beginning of changes that affected all of us. New boundaries and new connections appeared between us. It seemed that we all found ourselves in a complex game where the rules changed right during the game, and the stakes were much higher than we could imagine. It was difficult to predict how everything would turn out next. Time seemed to accelerate, and every day brought new challenges. We were faced with a choice: to stay in our comfort zone or to take a risk and break the walls that had long begun to press. My role in this story was not just that of an observer. I felt that my decisions could affect the course of events, and this gave me a sense of responsibility that I had not noticed before. I began to look at everything from a different perspective, to look for answers where I had not looked before, and although the tension continued to keep everyone tense, moments of sincerity and warmth broke through between us. These moments became like islands of safety in a sea of uncertainty. They gave me the strength to move forward and not give up. The evening was over, but its consequences remained with us. Everything that had been hidden or forgotten now began to return to the surface, demanding attention and resolution. We stood on the threshold of a new story, a story about family, about choice, about forgiveness, and about the strength to stay together, even when everything seemed against us. That evening was a turning point. It opened the door through which each of us had to go to find our place, our truth, and our happiness. And although the path was difficult, it promised that there would be new beginnings and new opportunities ahead. After that evening, the air around her became saturated with new emotions and experiences. Every step reminded her of a change that was happening imperceptibly but inevitably. She felt that even the most mundane little things took on significance, as if they were the keys to solving what was happening between them. Memories that had once seemed forgotten gradually made their way to the surface, bringing back not only joy but also pain, unhealed wounds. And unresolved conflicts, the brother who had previously seemed carefree and confident now revealed himself from an unexpected side. His smile, which had once been light and sincere, now hid something incomprehensible, like a mask under which doubts and fears were hidden. His wife remained a shadow moving nearby, but her gaze was cold and distant. Like a stone impervious to any influence, they all, like players on a complex chessboard, made moves without fully understanding the consequences. The tension in the house was growing, but at the same time there was a feeling of expectation, as if something important was about to happen, but for now it remained beyond comprehension. She began to notice how the relationships between everyone present were changing. Unexpected events became an occasion for new conversations, albeit without words. Gestures, looks, subtle hints, all this was combined into a silent language that had to be learned to understand. A feeling of anxiety mixed with hope, and this created a strange contrast that did not give rest. As the days passed, each of us began to understand in our own way what family only meant. It wasn't just a word or a promise, it was a test we had to go through together. Each step revealed new limits of patience and understanding, new challenges and obstacles. Work, routine, meetings with friends, all of that now took a back seat. This small but complex world, where emotions, fears, and desires intertwined, became the main thing. We tried to maintain balance, but it wasn't easy, because the situation resembled a thin thread that could break at any moment. Everyone tried to maintain a facade of normality, but hidden conflicts simmered beneath it. From time to time, it seemed that someone was about to snap, and then everything would spill over into an open argument. But instead, we chose silence, which was bitter and difficult. She began to think more and more about what was happening. She searched for answers within herself, trying to understand her feelings and what she saw around her. This internal struggle was no less difficult than external events. One morning, everything changed. A sudden event disrupted the usual rhythm, opening the door to new opportunities and challenges. It was the beginning of a new chapter, in which there was no place for fear or doubt. She felt that now everything depended on her choice, on her willingness to take responsibility for her life and for those around her. And although it was scary, she knew that this was the only way to true freedom. This part of life was like a trial by fire, but at the same time an opportunity to become stronger, wiser. And while everyone around her continued to search for answers, she took a step forward to a new beginning, to a new world. The holiday continued, but the atmosphere changed. Everything that seemed warm and familiar was now hidden behind masks of politeness and pretended care. Their glances avoided each other, their gestures became measured, and their smiles were more like grimaces than expressions of sincerity. Each of them was a test for the others, and each minute together seemed too long. She felt like a guest in a house that had once been familiar and dear to her. Now this house breathed of alienation. Her brother began to behave differently. His steps became louder, his movements sharper, his glances brief, as if he did not want to accidentally meet her eyes. He avoided moments together, leaving the room as soon as she entered. His wife, on the contrary, was almost constantly nearby, but her silence was heavier than any words. She did not show either anger or contempt openly, but her whole posture spoke more than any phrase could say. She continued to pretend that everything was fine. She got up in the morning, helped in the kitchen, smiled in the photo, and tried not to stand out. But the tension was growing inside. She knew that this was not just a misunderstanding or a random insult. What had happened was a symptom of something much deeper, something that had been taking shape over the years. She remembered how, as a child, their family had seemed united. Her parents had never hidden their affection for her brother, but then she had taken it for granted. He was younger, more vulnerable, more in need of support. But over time, she had noticed how this dominance had turned into an unconditional advantage. He was forgiven more, he was praised more often, and her efforts went unnoticed. Over the years, it had accumulated, and now, in adulthood, it had begun to take shape in a clear pattern. There was no place for her in this family. She was awkward, too straightforward, and did not meet expectations. Horror. Opinions were ignored, her achievements were compared to those of her brother, and when she spoke of her own successes, it was perceived as bragging. Her whole life was like a struggle for the right to be equal. While they all sat at the table, imitating the family idol, she felt everything inside her shrink. She could no longer hide the pain that had accumulated over the years. And although she did not say a word, her presence in itself became a challenge. She no longer played by their rules. She did not apologize or ask permission. She simply was. It irritated them. The situation escalated with each passing day. Little things that had previously gone unnoticed were now perceived as challenges. If she stood by the window, it seemed as if she was eavesdropping on something. If she stayed in the kitchen longer, she was suspected of being a deliberate meddler. If she remained silent, it was interpreted as a show of disrespect. Everything she did provoked a reaction. Her brother increasingly disappeared from the house, citing work or meetings. Her brother's wife took on the role of hostess, and her every action was like a performance. Everything had to be perfect, controlled, and spectacular. The other relatives, though they tried to remain neutral, no longer hid their discomfort. They seemed to be waiting for it all to end. She could feel it, but what struck her most was the indifference. Not open conflict, not resentment, but a cold, sharp indifference. They didn't try to change her or convince her, they simply excluded her from the space she had once been a part of. On the last evening, before returning home, she was left alone for a few minutes. For the first time in a long time, silence. In this silence, she could hear her own thoughts. Not resentment, not pain, not anger. Just the calm realization that she didn't have to be a part of something that was destroying her. These days had given her more than she had expected. They had shown her that she was stronger than she thought. That she no longer had to fight for someone's approval. That love didn't beg or beg. And that being free sometimes meant leaving behind what hurt, even if it was called family. When she got into the car, her hands didn't shake. There were no tears in her eyes. There was only a sense of inner completion. She didn't know what her next winter would be like, but she knew for sure that it would be different. And without any unnecessary masks. The next morning she woke up earlier than anyone else. The house was silent. Except for the old tree outside the window creaking from the wind playing through the glass. She sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, remembering last night. Everything that had happened no longer hurt, no longer burned, but simply became part of a picture that she no longer wanted to look at. She got dressed, went out into the kitchen, and, as usual, began to prepare breakfast. She did this not because anyone asked or expected her to. It was simply easier to gather her thoughts. When everyone gathered at the table, she felt a new wave of tension. Not because anything had been said, on the contrary, the silence had become denser. Her presence seemed to press on each of them. They did not know how to behave, to avoid or ignore, and so each time they chose something in between. Uncomfortable and tense. Her brother looked away, and his wife, not even trying to hide her contempt, had stopped reacting to her existence in any way. She noticed that one of her nephews, a little one who didn't know how to lie yet, was constantly looking at her with curiosity. His gaze was pure, without judgment, just childish interest. And only in him did she See something that reminded her of the past, of the times when everything still made sense. But even he didn't dare approach, because the house had rules that were not spoken, but everyone followed. She was on the outskirts of this system, she wasn't touched, but she wasn't accepted either. When breakfast was over, she went out into the yard. The cold was sharp, but it was soothing. She walked along the fence, watching the clouds move over the rooftops, and finally stopped. Where their childhood home had once been, there was now a pile of wood. It had been torn down a few years ago to make way for a new addition, but that addition had never been built. In its place was a void that nothing had filled. This pile of wood seemed to her a symbol of everything that had happened. Once there had been memories, games, secrets, jokes, promises. Now there were only ruins. She stood there, breathing in the cold air, wondering why her story had taken this path. What was wrong with her character, her choices, her attitude? Or was it wrong that she had spent so long trying to fit into someone else's frame? At lunchtime, everyone gathered again in the room where the fireplace stood. The gifts no longer evoked emotion. Everything went mechanically. Hand it over, thank you, smile, unwrap it. When it was her turn, her brother didn't even hand her the box, his wife just threw it on the edge of the table. She took the gift, unwrapped it, saw the carelessly chosen item, and put it back. No surprise, no smile. Just another moment that didn't matter. After that, she went to her room and closed the door. She had had enough. 4. The first time in a long time, she allowed herself to just sit, do nothing, not analyze, not remember. Just be. There was laughter coming from the street, and conversations were going on in the house, but none of that had any effect anymore. She listened to these sounds in silence, like background music to a movie. She was no longer in the evening. When everyone was getting ready for dinner, she went outside again. This time she walked further, to the old greenhouse. It had once been a place where she had hidden herself when she wanted to be alone. And although everything there was abandoned now, it still held some traces of her past. She went inside, carefully walked between the broken shelves. Stopped by the wall where their childhood inscriptions still remained there. On the wall, their names were still written. Hers was first. Her brother's was a little lower. She ran her finger over these letters. The past seemed to hit her like a wave. The tears did not flow. She did not feel like it anymore. But somewhere inside, something finally fell. She felt the heaviness that had been pressing on her all these days gradually recede. Here, for the first time in a long time, she felt herself again. When she returned to the house, no one said anything. And that was good. She gathered her things, spread everything out in her suitcase, checked her documents, and sat by the window. There, in the greenhouse, she realized everything that was between them had long since died. But not because she had done anything wrong, but because they didn't need someone like her. She would no longer make excuses, explain, or prove anything. She would no longer suffer in silence. She had seen enough to understand. Love does not live where people fight for it alone. She had come to say goodbye. Not to her house. Not to her family. But to herself, the one who had waited her whole life for someone to change, to understand, to appreciate. The next day she was to leave. And this time for good. Not just physically. For the first time, she was truly leaving this place. She had been awake for most of the night. Her thoughts kept her awake, like a broken clockwork that ticked without a break. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, something was making noise somewhere in the pipes, and all of this together created an atmosphere of expectation of something important. But she was not afraid. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the morning. Because she knew that this day would be different. She had been packing slowly since morning. There was no rush. Each thing was put into the suitcase with a sense of finality. Everything that had once been important to her in this house now remained here, without regret, without sadness. In the hallway, the suitcase was covered with a soft layer of dust. No one noticed her packing, no one asked where she was going. Because everyone had long been accustomed to her silently disappearing when things got crowded. Voices could be heard in the living room. Laughter. The sound of dishes. They were celebrating as if nothing had happened. And it was the most accurate reflection of everything. She felt, even when her heart was pounding, the world around her lived in its usual rhythm. She walked through the rooms again. She looked at the old photographs. At the furniture left by her parents. At the empty vases and books with yellowed pages. Everything was preserved here except warmth. She went out into the yard, sat down on a bench and watched the sky fill with cold light. A plan was maturing in her head. Not escape, liberation. She no longer wanted to play a role in someone else's script. She did not want to endure silence for the sake of simply being there. And most importantly, she no longer sought anyone's approval. At lunchtime, she gathered all her willpower into a fist and returned to the house. Everyone was already sitting at the table. She opened the door and stood on the threshold. The gazes stopped on her, but quickly dispersed. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. Everyone expected her to say something, but she was silent. She just stood. And in this silence her victory was born. She opened her notebook, took out a sheet of paper and placed it on the table. It was a letter. There were no accusations in it. Just a simple description of how she had felt all these years. There was no anger there, only a calm refusal to do what was no longer needed. She left him, turned and left, without even looking back. A familiar car was waiting for her in the courtyard. She sat down, threw her suitcase in the back seat and signaled to go. The driver did not ask anything. He drove silently while the landscape outside the window changed. She looked at the gray fields, abandoned buildings, the interweaving of branches and wires. The world outside the house was the same as inside, uncertain, cold, but at the same time open. In her new place, she was greeted by an empty space. She rented a small room that barely fit a bed, a nightstand, and an old table. But it was her territory. No pressure, no prying eyes. She unpacked her suitcase, took out a notebook, and began to write. Her hands trembled a little, but she didn't stop. For the first time in a long time, the words flowed freely. In the following days, she walked a lot. She looked for alleys where she could disappear among the passers-by. She went into bookstores, sat on benches, and watched people. And she saw a story in every face. Someone was laughing, someone was talking on the phone, someone was running in the rain. The world was alive, and for the first time, she felt like she could be a part of this world. A few weeks later, she got a job. A modest but stable one. The team was simple. No unnecessary questions, no suspicions. They gave her space and time to get used to it. And she gradually came to life. She began taking photos, creating collages, writing short texts that she never published anywhere, but which helped her regain her voice. And then, one day, in the midst of her daily routine, she received a message from her brother. For the first time in all these months. No apologies, no explanations, just a few lines in which he asked how she was. She stared at those words for a long time. She answered briefly, but not with resentment. She was no longer the one waiting for reconciliation. She simply had nothing more to lose. The next day, she went to the greenhouse again. But not to the one where childhood memories had once grown, but to a new one, a small one, on the outskirts of the city. There, among the greenery, she found peace. She began to help the old woman take care of the plants. The earth, which had previously seemed dead, now gave life. And with each leaf that bloomed, she herself seemed to sprout anew. Life had not become perfect. The problems did not disappear. But something else appeared, support within herself. Where there had been a desire to prove before, now peace settled. She no longer sought agreement. She simply lived. And every morning, waking up in her room, she knew, finally, everything was in its place. Several months had passed since that moment. The weather changed, the cold receded, and a lightness appeared in the air that she had not felt for a long time. Everything around her began to bloom, as if hinting that the time for change had come not only in nature, but also in herself. She got used to the new rhythm. Her morning began with coffee, a short walk through the narrow streets, after which she got down to business. Someone ordered texts from her, someone asked for help with design, and someone simply called, because they knew that she knew how to listen. She no longer sought to draw attention to herself, but attention founded itself. She spent several hours in the greenhouse every day. The earth no longer seemed silent to her. She saw movement in every plant, meaning in every stem. Her hands were no longer afraid to touch the dirt. Because it was alive, real, it responded with warmth. The woman she worked with didn't ask too much. She simply taught. And this simplicity became an outlet for her. There, among the greenhouses and the rustling of greenery, she understood that the world doesn't always require struggle. One morning she received an unexpected letter. It was an envelope, written in her usual handwriting. No stamp, no signature. Inside was a sheet of paper with lines that were easily recognizable. It was her brother. He wrote briefly, with his characteristic directness, without apologizing, without making excuses. He simply informed her that there had been changes in their home. That her parents had asked about her. That her wife no longer showed up for the holidays. That now the silence in the house reminded her of her absence. She reread the letter several times, but she felt nothing. There was no anger, pain, or joy. There was only a strange balance. For the first time, she understood that her presence or absence no longer defined her value. She no longer needed permission to be herself. However, these words stirred something inside. Not the past, because she had said goodbye to it, but that inner question that had been lying in silence for a long time, was everything really over? The next day she packed her things and set off on her journey. Without a clear goal, without a plan. She wanted to just keep moving forward until she felt the need to stop. The road was long. She changed trains, buses, passed through large stations and small ones. People next to her talked, laughed, and remained silent. In every look, she saw life continuing regardless of her story. And this was the main discovery: her pain was not the center of the world. On the third day of her journey, she stopped at a hotel. A modest place with the smell of old wood and heavy curtains. She settled herself by the window, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to fall asleep without fear. Childhood memories returned in her dreams, running barefoot through the corridors, the smell of a pie that had just come out of the oven, the shadows from the curtains swaying in the draft. All this had long since disappeared, but in her memory it lived more vividly than reality. In the morning, she woke up with the feeling that something had resolved itself. She had no more questions. about the past. She was no longer drawn back. But the desire to finish remained. Not for anyone, for herself. So she bought one last ticket. To the place that had once been called home. When she stepped onto the familiar threshold, everything looked different. The house seemed smaller, the windows darker, the trees around it taller. Her brother opened the door. Differently than before, without a smile, without mockery. He just stood there. She walked past him in silence. There was silence in the living room. Her mother was sitting in an armchair, her father was leafing through a newspaper. All eyes were focused on her, but not a single one was judging. She expected nothing. And, in the end, she said nothing. In the room that had once been hers, there was a bed and several boxes. On the table was her old notebook. She took it, opened it, and saw her childhood notes. Simple words, ungainly letters, but in each of them a voice that she had once silenced. She sat down, turned page after page, and with each of them she freed herself. Not from memories, but from the duty to carry them. At dinner she did not participate in the conversation. She listened. She looked at the faces that had not become closer over the years, but were no longer hostile. She understood no one here had changed radically. But she had changed. And this turned out to be enough for her not to feel superfluous in this silence. At night she went out into the courtyard. The stars were bright, the air was cool. She inhaled the air and felt there was no more fear. There was no burden. She had not come to reconcile, but to leave for good. Not to run away, but to say goodbye. Morning came calmly. She packed her things, leaving nothing behind. No one stopped her, and that was right. She did not leave the nest, because she had known for a long time that her wings had grown in flight, not here. On the way back, she did not look out the window. She knew that something important had already happened, not an event, but a decision. She no longer carried with her shadows, expectations, and images. Only she remained strong, alive, confident. In the new city, she stopped on the same street. The greenhouse doors were closed, but she knew that she would open them when the time came. She went to the window, looked at the greenery that was breaking through the glass, and smiled for the first time, not out of politeness, not out of pain, but out of deep understanding. She no longer owed anyone anything. She returned home.